Assalamu alaikum. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Muslim Network TV and my program, Critical Talk. This evening, we're going to be talking about a rarely, if ever, spoken about concern, and that is with widows in the Muslim community. Dr. Deborah Majeed, who is a professor emeritus from Beloit College, has just completed some very interesting research on this topic that we never talk about. So, this evening, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about some of the things that should be talked about in the masjid. But first, I would like to introduce Dr. Deborah Mcgee, who is an author, well-known lecturer, and you can look her up. And I want to get to this really groundbreaking research. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Dr. McLeod Al-Deen. Good to be with you.
Go ahead. Tell us. Well, let me ask this question.
Yes.
What made you decide that this was some research you had to engage?
Well, if you recall, at the beginning of the pandemic, we became aware in the association of the leadership of Imam W.D. Muhammad, rahimahullah, that we had a number of women for whom GoFundMe pages were being organized because they had lost their husbands and had some of natural causes, other because of illness, and some because of COVID. But bottom line, they were ill prepared, and their husbands had left them ill prepared for the journey that they were about to embark upon. And so I was curious about what we as a community should and could do in support what those women were doing themselves, and how the our religion teaches us to respond to widow maintenance.
You know, it's very interesting you say that, because I don't think, except for their close friends, anybody ever thought about them. You know, even though people knew people were dying and that are very, very ill in the hospital, and all kinds of bills mounting, because even if it wasn't hospital bills, it was all the other bills of the home while they were sick and dying. So, how did you set up this research?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that not all women have the same experience. Their experiences run the gamut from being in communities that were fully aware and under the leadership of imams who would say, we're not waiting on them to contact us, we will contact them. And
Wow.
that contact will be consistent on one end. And then on the other end, we would have women who reached out but did not receive any assistance. Others who wanted to reach out but didn't know how. And people in their community were uncomfortable reaching out to women whose status was now single, right? And then you had, communities for whom the teaching about what the Quran, the directives or guidelines that Islamic authorities will provide, just wasn't there. So I was really interested in how these women would have what their experience, what they were going through. And so I knew a few, and so I contacted them. I also contacted Sister Tahira, who runs Heart's Connection. She also is a widow. Heart's Connection is a African American, well, not just African American, but a widow support group.
Oh, wait a minute. Can you give that name again?
It's Heart's Connection. And before
.com.
Don't go there. But before after the end of the show, I can look it up and send it to you. Or when we're on a break, I'll try to find it. But
Uh-huh.
anyway, she was a widow herself and in need of support financially, morally, spiritually, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she embarked upon an important service to our community that is also rare, and that is a widow support group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I also put out online. I made some connections online with people, and I started in March 2020 distributing surveys, and I received responses from 50 women.
Wow.
And then I interviewed, conducted in depth interviews of 30 of those women.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, we collected data from 19 of their imams.
Wow.
So that's our data source.
Wow. So this is I get to explore a diversity of
Yeah.
so let me ask, what was the majority? No, what were the questions that you asked?
Well, some of the questions were during your marriage, did you and your husband ever have a conversation or make any plans about how you would be protected should he precede you in death?
Okay.
How did you cover the expenses of his janazah?
Right.
During your marriage, do you ever recall attending a khutbah or a talim or any other teaching event at your masjid in which Al-Baqarah, um, the verses in Al-Baqarah were referenced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another question was, what kind of advice do you have for women in your similar situation? What kind of advice do you have for mosque leadership of what we can do to better support and care for widows?
Wow. That's a
Yeah.
concise set of
Well, we tried to be, and we wanted to keep it short,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But the interviews were actually 30 to 90 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the interviews were not completed.
Okay.
And they were not completed because the women could not talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so I don't include them in the number of 30, but there were women I spoke to who cried the whole way, and I said, should we stop?
Mm-hmm.
It was just too raw for them,
Yeah,
right?
I can see that.
Too raw. And it was an emotional consideration. And some women are still trying to adjust to their new surrounding. I can give you some demographics.
Okay.
Um, I can find that they are. Let me go to my
I can't turn it off.
yeah. So we have. Let's see. So the women in the survey are 31 to 79 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
They married men who were 31 to 80 years of age. The shortest marriage among the widows was 4 years. The longest marriage was 52 years. 18% of the sisters said they did remarry. And of those who did not, they talk about how it wouldn't be fair to the next man, and that if they were to remarry, it would only happen by the will of Allah, that they weren't seeking a mate.
So let
There,
me ask this.
mhm,
For the women who lost their husbands during COVID, which was
yeah.
new, they had already remarried?
No, we
No.
have no. So this is a span of time. A number of women had lost their husbands. Not all these women had lost their husbands during COVID.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking about some go back to the late 1990s, and
Oh,
so those though they had remarried,
okay.
right? A
Okay.
couple of sisters had been widowed twice.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them had similar experiences in those two spaces, and other times not. Those sisters who lost their husbands during COVID, at least one was an international marriage. So
Mhm.
she couldn't travel there.
Right,
At
right.
least one was involved a polygynous marriage, and
Okay.
how one wife was able to attend and the other could not because of travel restrictions,
Mm.
right? So you're dealing with those kinds of issues. For some women, particularly during COVID, it was a matter of dealing with non-Muslim family members who expected their
Oh,
son or father
mhm.
to be married within a Christian context, right? And so the sisters had to deal with that kind of situation. And then others, you had the situation where the children, adult children from a previous marriage of the husband were more well known to the masjid leadership than the widow was. And so their perspectives and their choices reigned over hers.
That is interesting. I want to go back to these categories, some of
Mm-hmm.
which I know people don't think of. Let's take a moment's break, and I'm going to ask you to choose. You talked about being in polygamy. You talked about an international marriage. You
Mm-hmm.
talked about where the family of the man, or well, the man was Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and stuff intervened, as to how that was supposed to go. But you also talked about where there had been previous marriage and the children better known to the masjid, their choices reigned over the widow. So I want to go back into those, and let's
Mm-hmm.
take a minute or two break. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV, having a conversation with Dr. Deborah Majeed over her research on Muslim widows. We'll be right back.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an
Our neighbors don't
eye-catching
realize
message.
that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an Imam in Chicago.
60 shots! No me! No justice! No me!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world?
You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward.
That lesson learned brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen, Muslim Network TV with Critical Talk, and I'm talking with Dr. Deborah Mcgee about her research, and it's still recent, her research on Muslim widows. And I want to go back, as I told you before we broke, with a couple of the segments of this population that you talk about. And one is an international marriage.
Yeah.
What is that?
So this had to do with polygyny. And so you had one wife living in the States who went to visit her husband in another country. And he had her co-wife lived in a second or third country, right? And so when the husband passed, the Western wife was with him. And so she was able to arrange all of the necessary events surrounding his janazah, but her co-wife was unable to attend.
But she had money or something in order to be able to have that janazah.
Yes. So let me put it like this: the family had money.
Ah, okay.
The family had money, and that was often the case. When I think about, or I should say, when the women in the survey talk about how they covered their husband's janazah, a typical method was life insurance and personal savings.
Okay.
But there also were some sisters who said they had inheritance, or they had assistance, financial assistance from family and friends. And sometimes that family / friends included masjid community.
Mhm.
A couple of sisters said, we had invested some money, so I was able to use that. Only 3 of the sisters had prepaid all expenses. And then for one sister, her daughter covered all expenses for the janazah. Now, it's interesting that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I said it's interesting that on some level, the national identity of the husband did not necessarily equate to a robust community support for his widow, nor, let me just leave it like that. It did not. So there were a couple of national leaders whose wives did not experience that kind of high level of care and love that they thought they would. And also the national identity of the husband would not necessarily equate to his preparation for his own family. So I'm talking about imams, right? With national exposure.
African American imams or
yes,
imams?
African American imams whose families were not prepared.
And I would guess that in those situations, COVID was not a help because it came on suddenly. You wound up, within days.
So that just raised the stress level, even higher. And one sister talked about the fact that this is pre-COVID, she was arranging the events, or arranging all of the care that she would need for her janazah.
Okay.
And her husband was with her while she's making preparations for her janazah. Now she's just being prepared, right? He did not like talking about death. And like so many of us, even though death is so much a part of life, especially in Islam, but he didn't like talking about it, right? So she's making the preparations for her janazah. He's there. And ultimately, she used her preparations for him as he preceded her in death.
That is very, very special. You began talking about how some women were left with having to go and post GoFundMe pages.
Yeah,
because
some
no
women
preparations had been met.
Yes. So for some, GoFundMe pages were organized on their behalf, right? But for others, because they're, and that was what was so striking about me, because it wasn't until, at least in my experience, wasn't until around 2019 that you really began to see GoFundMe pages because we couldn't interact physically, right? So you have an onslaught of those kinds of situations, and I was just so concerned and just really just burdened. And I even had a conversation with my husband as a result. And I said, listen, I've established this. I need you to do this, so that we had to have real conversations ourselves, and we still have ongoing conversations about what we would want, because he has adult children.
Right.
And I want to make sure that if he precedes me in death, they know what I'm supposed to have and what he wanted, what his wishes were, and also that he's preparing for me to be able to fulfill his wishes and also for my own protection.
Well, that was another category where you mentioned the children were known from a previous marriage better in the masjid and just superseded the wife's, which I know just tore them up, the wife's desires.
Yeah, and that was the good news is that was rare. And I'm so grateful to say, even in my own situation, to have a wonderful relationship with my husband's daughter, for example. And we have been very clear on desires. And so we work well together. But that was not the situation of every sister. And what was sometimes traumatic, at least for one sister, was the challenges that she experienced with her husband's, one of his children, and that child's mother. So this would be an ex-spouse. So this just reminded me how much the issue of widow maintenance is not a private issue. It's not simply a personal issue. It's not a sister's problem, but this is a community concern, right? I do have some, the findings led to certain conclusions, one in which sisters need to be taken care of, taking more responsibility for their own education and empowerment. But having said that, the issue of widow maintenance is a community concern because it can be a major and very visible community challenge.
Wow. I'm just thinking if somebody were to decide that I could not take over the instructions and whatever of my husband were to precede me, or if somebody were to take it over from him, I would be just.
Yeah, this one sister, they were having conversations about whether she could speak at the janazah, whether the ex-wife needed to speak if she spoke, those kinds of situations.
Why was she speaking? She's not married to him anymore.
I did not go there. But this just lets you know how stressful this issue how stressful this issue can be in general. But when you have undecided or undealt with issues from prior relationships, and many of us have been married before, when we haven't discussed all of that, we haven't worked all of that out, those kind of issues are heightened in their severity, often at the point of death.
Well, also for those men who worked and had Social Security, had other kinds of benefits, some of those benefits go to the ex-spouse. Some of them go to the new spouse. And I guess that would give the ex-spouse, if she chose, a way in to have something to say, if she chose to do that.
Well, yes, it's helpful if there has been a family discussion prior to. Too often what happens is that now the ex-wife and the widow are at each other, trying to position themselves, right? Because the husband left the family dynamics unresolved. Right. And if the leadership of the mosque is more familiar with, acquainted with the ex-wife or her family or her children, as was the situation of at least one sister, then that makes it a little complicated. Or if the masjid leadership was not, or I should say, if the widow was not someone who had a high esteem in the community, right? That could just complicate the issues, just a little more.
Wow.
Now, the good news is most of the sisters that I talked to, they didn't have those kinds of challenges. And like I said, There are some sisters for whom this was an easy, for lack of a better word, as easy as it can be, as easy one can think about, experience. But the larger issue is that widow maintenance, the way we approach it among Muslims, and I'm particularly referencing the community of Imam W.D. Muhammad, that too often, too many of us are approaching this issue in a way that is not in accordance with the teachings of Islam.
Well,
we can do better.
I think we need to work on that, because for wives left by husbands, whether it's by death or they just walked out the door or whatever, they were supposed to have already prepared a year's worth of maintenance. And if that's there, then widows or left women don't have to hustle with GoFundMe pages and other kinds of things, or descend into an abject poverty, being left without any support. And a lot of the Muslim women, I don't want to say of a certain age, because it's not of a certain age, don't work. And if they wanted to work, given dress, probably couldn't work.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing that should be brought up, and that's what I want to get to. And where your research leads us is to talk about concerns in the masjid, whether it's the khutbah, it's the talim, or halakha, or whatever, that is steady enough and regularized enough so that women and men learn what their responsibilities are. Unfortunately, our Imam Khalil Akbar could not be with us this evening to give us an Imam's point of view. Well, we'll just persevere without him and talk in general about some things that could happen. Right now, we're going to take our second minute or two break so you can get your thoughts together and I can have more tea. And we'll be right back. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Dr. Deborah Majeed, and we're talking about widows in particular, but also some concerns that arise in the community with life information. We'll be right back with Muslim Network TV and Critical Talk.
Assalamu alaikum!
I love Adam's World because it makes me learn in a fun way. That Adam has a green face and orange hair. I like this song. I like how Adam sings. I like Adam's World because it makes me happy. What? No. And here's Adam and here's Anissa. Adam is and his sister. Adam is a boy and he is very smart.
Download the new Adam's World app at adamsworldapp.com and let's help tomorrow's Muslims today.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Muslim Network TV and the program Critical Talk. And I am having the honor this evening of talking with Dr. Deborah Mcgee, who is finishing off a serious, critical, much needed piece of research on Muslim women who are widows, which leads to a whole bunch of other questions. What we should know, how do we build a knowledge bank, how we can not leave off what's in the Quran, which serves Dr. Majeed.
Yes. First of all, let me point out the objectives. We had three major objectives of this study. And the first one was that husband and wives who prepare, we wanted to increase the number of husbands and wives who prepare themselves and their families well, Quranically and materially, to deal with the loss of a spouse.
Right.
2, increase the number of wives who prepare themselves well, Quranically and materially, to live faithfully in the absence of a husband. 3, increase the number of masjid communities that heighten their engagement in the Quran and other available resources to educate and empower current and future generations about our obligations. And ultimately, we wanted to draw attention to the fact that widow maintenance is an issue that needs to be moved from the private sphere to the public space as an obligation of both individuals and communities. Now, I'm very proud and humbled to say that I, like several other women, am associated with a masjid here in Charlotte, Masjid Al-Shaheed, led by Imam Khalil Akbar. And this is a community that is very supportive. We know and attend to our widow and widowers at the time of death. So this isn't a place where, and the sisters who have lost their husbands in this space will tell you, I didn't have to worry about anything. I had little concern throughout the process. Years down the line, I still have people asking what can be done.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to bring this kind of awareness and the kind of focus nationwide, because particularly during this pandemic, when we are not engaging each other physically, people who find themselves, particularly women who find themselves in this situation, are alone on an even heightened level.
Yes.
And their needs become even heightened. And we have to address that in many of our masjids, we're aging communities. Yes. And some of the men who precede their wives in death did not have the opportunity or the time to build up Social Security.
Right.
They were entrepreneurs. They didn't pay into Social Security. Right. So there was even less financial resources for their wives to draw on.
Well, that's very important. And let's move into talking about how we can. Masjid Al-Shaheed apparently is one where both the men and the women and the Imam are forcing themselves to deal with life issues. Right. It's one thing to look the part of Muslim. It's another thing to really know what your obligations and responsibilities are, so that there is a healthy community from birth to death. And we need to really think about this in a book in which you and I both participated in, Half of Faith. We tried to deal with before marriage, marriage, and divorce, and issues of polygyny, which are still, I don't want to say as rampant as they used to be, but they may be rampant up again. I don't know. But these things which are ways to forestall issues later. Mm-hmm. What should be in a marriage contract? How should the couple be counseled when women and men are looking for spouses? What to look for? You got to look for somebody who has their head on their shoulders.
Right. Well, one of the major findings that emerged from this study was the importance of beginning in a premarital situation to talk about maintenance and other important issues that go from life to death. And that rather than just focusing on it, it's important to focus on a dower and mahar, how we're going to live, whether we're going to have a religious only or a religious and civilly registered marriage. But at that time, to put in place or begin to set a strategy or plan for how we will support each other if one of us precedes the other in death. It's also
even gets broken down. I mean, some of the folk didn't die after they had COVID, but became critical long haulers.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And from a strictly Islamic perspective, it was interesting to note that if you ask, if a typical question or a typical response from Muslims across the board, regardless of race, but the typical response from American Muslims, if you ask them about widows, what comes to mind? They will typically point to Al-Baqarah or chapter 2 of the Quran, ayah 234, which talks about her Edat period. So most of our teachings are, when we talk about widows, oh yeah, 4 months, she can't get married. She has to, she has to be respectful. She has to do this. We have to make sure she's not pregnant. All of that. That's the end from too many of us of our understanding about what the Quran says about widows. But if we need to go 6 verses down to ayah 240, which says, oh, guess what? You need to leave behind a year's
right
maintenance. That's not a discussion. That's not a typical cookbook. That's not a typical talim. For most of us, we don't, if our awareness or knowledge production is dependent upon, not that it should be, but if it is, and for too many of us, it is, if it's dependent upon what we are taught in a talim, a cookbook, a halakha circle, we don't know. So we can't prepare.
Right.
And what's even more important, that we as women cannot depend on external external guidance. We should naturally, like every Muslim, be going directly to our Quranic sources, our Islamic sources, resources for ourselves. We should be educating ourselves. We should be empowering our daughters.
Yeah,
but we can't
you
that.
won't do any of that without encouragement. If the talim,
I'm sorry, say that again.
If the cookbook, for example, is always on some lofty thing, if the talim follows that lofty thing, then every day never gets dealt with.
Yeah. And I'm excited to say here in Charlotte, and that's why, I wish Imam Khalil was able to join us, but a member of our masjid returned to Allah today. And so Imam Khalil is heavily engaged in dealing with the family in that respect. And it was a husband who left a wife.
Right.
Right.
Well,
so here,
and makes what we're talking about very important.
Even more important, yes. And here our teachings in our masjid, more often than not, are directly tied to everyday living experiences. How we apply what the Quran says to how we live in 21st century America. And there are few, if any, issues that we turn our backs on or run away from. But that's not the situation of too many of many of our mosques.
Let's say most, because it's not only the African American community.
I didn't want to go there because I don't have direct data on most, but I understand what you're saying.
I've been to loads of talim sessions and halakas, and the everyday is rarely talked about, as if we're in a bubble on planet X. And the everyday is not going to touch us.
Yeah,
we start doing other things, and that.
So which is why as the outgrowth of this study, I'm encouraging my subjects and others to let me know of imams who might be willing to have a talim on this topic, so that we can push the conversation and move to some changes or heighten awareness and education and empowerment in our masjids. I'm looking to sisters to say we have a service group or other halakha circle while we want to have this conversation. So education and empowerment will lead to liberation, but we really need to draw attention to this as a major issue. So
it's interesting because most Muslims will say to you that, Islam liberates women, but they don't have a clue as to how that happens. And that's because they haven't read the book. So I think that in addition to how we get your research published and Half of Faith, which we're going to embark upon a second part of that, I think we need to focus on some of those issues, not in academic ease, but in everyday language, so that we can provide some encouragement. And for our audience, Half of Faith is online and it is a free access. And hopefully in communities, it will bring about some of these questions, because we can't let Dr. Majeed's community be the only one out there that has sense enough to push. I mean, people pushing each other, trying to have a very healthy community.
Right.
It has to be a model that leads the way. And lastly, I wanted to ask, and the Imam is not here, but I wanted to ask if we could think of a series of content for khutbahs for the whole year of 2022, what would be in it?
I would start with the cultivation and the maintenance of healthy family life. And that will include making sure that you have what you offer at the masjid, number one, is accessible and is attractive to young people. And by young people, I mean 13 to 30.
Yeah.
We need them much more in leadership positions, not just in you want to do something, we'll let you organize it, but in pivotal leadership positions that address all issues across the board. That's one issue. Another, we need to talk about our obligations, the benefits we derived, and our responsibilities as individuals and as community to the maintenance of married life. We talk about marriage as half of our religion, but we don't explain how to live that half. And then thirdly, what do we do about those individuals, women and men, who by circumstance or choice don't appear to be living or interested in living half of their religion?
You got a point there.
In other words, they don't want to be married again.
One of the things I heard was there's no consequence for bad behavior. There's no it's the privacy notion goes beyond belief. I mean, you have men, when people are around, they're happy, they speak well of their wives or husbands, and then when everybody's gone, they treat them like dogs. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, that is true.
Yeah,
that is true. And I think if we were more comfortable, to the extent to which we are aware and comfortable meaning knowing our responsibilities and situated to address them, the extent to which we are that is the extent to which you'll see a healthy community where all members have their rights protected. Where we're not aware and we're not positioned to address our obligations, you're less likely to see that.
Yeah, but I think young people are looking for the safety and the security of a healthy community. And that way they can think about how to navigate this onslaught of stuff happening now. Because there's no guidance.
And they're looking for a situation that is accessible on levels at which they communicate.
Yeah.
Because some of their formats are not the same as ours, right?
Yeah.
And how we assess their interest and their involvement needs to not be on the models of assessment that we would normally
Exactly.
So we have work to do. I see that work as I do with the issue of widow maintenance as an opportunity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has showed us. You all can do this. You have the resources to do this. I'm showing you what needs to be done So, hello. Yeah.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I peeked in on one of your sessions with results, and one of the things I got from the women immediately was resilience, sadness, but an incredible resilience. And some of the kinds of suggestions they made, let's go forth, let's do this, let's make groups, I'm saying, my goodness, what can I have some of that energy? I mean, it was just, and one woman spoke of, and we haven't talked about it here, is the loss of children.
Yes.
And while that's not a widow, I think it affects death, especially, I mean, whether it's a long illness and then death, or it's a surprise and a shock. How do you got to bury those kids too?
Yeah.
That's come across on the GoFundMe pages too, where communities don't have funds, or stuff people can pay into. We're now here in Maryland. My husband was calling around trying to find out, well, where, I mean, he's a vet, so it's kind of taken care of, but it's where do people bury people? Is there a fund you can pay in? Because even if you don't need it, paying into it may help somebody else so that they don't have to get embarrassed or humiliated going to a GoFundMe page.
Right. It's like you said, it behooves us to give more attention to the idea that Islam is a living religion that takes us, we come from Allah, we return to Allah, and every stage in between, how we bear witness to the God we claim to serve.
Yeah.
And so how we serve each other, how we respond to each other, how we even represent ourselves says something about that sense of faith. And the extent to which we spend more time working that out and embodying the truths of that, would be much better. I'm working with, or striving to work with a young woman who is separated from her husband. She's planning divorce. She's been in a domestic violence situation. He's Muslim, she's not. And when you talk to her, she sounds like she's trying to live Islam more than he is. But she's the one in the shelter.
Wow.
She's the one who has the 2 children. She's the one fighting for child support.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of these issues, and back to the, there has to be justice in the masjid. And if a man can't treat his wife well, then the community has to decide, do we want him around until he gets his act together, or she gets her act together? It's some things that don't need to be hidden. Need to be out there.
Yep, I agree.
Well, I'm going to give you, and I hope after we do the second part, a half of faith, to have all of us back on Critical Talk. But I want to give you the last few words, and more than.
Well, I want to say we had 4 major findings of the studies, 4 conclusions that I want to leave the audience with. That I believe are key to our study, and to the extent that every mosque, it would behoove all of us to take a closer look. And that is, number 1, our approach to widow maintenance as it appears now in the United States is un-Islamic. 2, there's a misplaced authority for Islamic knowledge and the practice that leaves women and children vulnerable, and we need to address that. 3, the ordinary needs of widows that can be addressed by community members are too frequently overlooked. And 4, and perhaps most importantly, women need to empower and educate themselves, even as we expect husbands and mosque communities to fulfill their obligations. the concept or issue of widow maintenance is a community issue, but sisters may have to be our own saviors in this respect.
There you go. Powerful, powerful. Oh, this has been so enlightening. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen, who's had a more than instructive, this has been a serious class here with Dr. Deborah Mcgee, starting with widow maintenance and how we think about our communities and the life circumstances that happens that has led us to build a thing to begin to talk about healthy communities. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your being here with me tonight. And my condolences go to whoever it was that died in your community so that the Imam could not be here with us. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Dr. Deborah Majeed on Muslim Network TV and Critical Talk. We'll see you again tomorrow.